There was a particular Friday evening in early March of 1957 when Harold Jessup stood in his barn in southern Indiana, holding a well-worn almanac in one hand and a pencil in the other. The pages were dog-eared, stained with soil and coffee rings, passed down from his father, who'd gotten it from his own father before him. Harold was planning his spring planting, but he wasn't just checking frost dates or rainfall predictions. He was studying something his neighbors in town had started calling superstition, something the agricultural extension agents dismissed with polite smiles, something that made his wife roll her eyes when he mentioned it at Sunday dinner. He was planting by the signs. All across rural America during the 1950s and into the 1960s, something curious was happening. Even as tractors replaced horses, even as hybrid seeds promised revolutionary yields, even as chemical fertilizers were being advertised in every farm magazine, thousands of farmers were quietly consulting the same ancient system their ancestors had used. They were watching the moon, tracking its phases, noting which zodiac sign it occupied on any given day, and timing their planting, cultivating, and harvesting accordingly. And many of them swore, absolutely swore, that their yields had jumped because of it. This wasn't happening in isolated pockets or just among the oldest generation clinging to tradition. It was spreading. Young farmers who'd returned from World War II with new ideas about efficiency and science were finding themselves drawn back to methods that seemed to defy the modern agricultural revolution happening all around them. The phenomenon was particularly strong in the Appalachian regions, throughout the Midwest, across the South, and in rural communities where farming knowledge still passed from parent to child in the fields, rather than in university classrooms. To understand why this happened, you have to understand what American farming looked like in that era. The decade following World War II brought unprecedented changes to agriculture. The government was pushing modernization hard. New chemical fertilizers developed from wartime munitions technology were flooding the market. Mechanical combines were becoming affordable for mid-sized operations. Agricultural extension services were teaching scientific approaches to soil management, pest control, and crop rotation. Everything was supposed to be getting more rational, more predictable, more controlled. But here's what the agricultural bulletins and university experts often missed. Farming in the real world remained stubbornly unpredictable. A farmer could follow every recommendation from the Extension Service, use the finest hybrid seed, apply fertilizer according to the latest soil test, and still watch a neighboring farmer with older methods get better results. Weather remained capricious. Pests didn't always respond to the newest chemicals the way the labels promised. Soil, despite all the testing, still held mysteries. And in that gap between scientific promise and agricultural reality, old knowledge found new life. The tradition of planting by the signs stretched back centuries in American farming culture, brought from Europe, where it had roots going back to ancient agricultural societies. The basic principle was straightforward. The moon's phase and its position relative to the 12 zodiac constellations influenced when you should plant, cultivate, harvest, or leave the soil alone. It was lunar gardening, astrological agriculture, whatever you wanted to call it. But by the 1950s, it had developed into a surprisingly sophisticated system with specific rules that farmers followed with the same precision they brought to any other aspect of their operations. The moon took approximately 29.5 days to complete its cycle from new moon to full moon and back again. As it traveled through the sky, it passed through the 12 zodiac signs, spending roughly 2.5 days in each. Different signs were classified according to the 4 classical elements: earth, water, air, and fire. Earth signs were Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn. Water signs were Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces. Air signs were Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius. Fire signs were Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius. And crucially, different signs were associated with different parts of plants. Earth signs were considered root days, best for planting and tending crops grown for their roots: potatoes, carrots, turnips, beets, onions. Water signs were leaf days, ideal for leafy vegetables like lettuce, cabbage, spinach, and particularly good for crops where you wanted lush foliage. Air signs were flower days, perfect for planting anything that would bloom, including flowering ornamentals, but also crops like broccoli and cauliflower, where the flower is what you harvest. Fire signs were fruit and seed days, best for crops like tomatoes, peppers, beans, peas, corn, and anything else where the fruit or seed was the desired product. But it wasn't just about the zodiac sign. The moon's phase mattered enormously. The period from new moon to full moon, when the moon was waxing and showing more light each night, was generally considered the best time for planting annual crops that produced their yield above ground. The theory was that as the moon's light increased, it pulled moisture up through the soil, encouraging seeds to germinate and plants to grow vigorously upward. The period from full moon to new moon, when the moon was waning and showing less light each night, was traditionally used for planting root crops, for cultivation and weeding, for pruning and for harvesting crops intended for storage. In practical terms, a farmer planting by the signs in 1958 might wait for a waxing moon in a water sign like Cancer to plant his lettuce and cabbage. He'd plant his tomatoes and beans during a waxing moon in a fire sign like Sagittarius. His potatoes would go in during a waning moon in an earth sign like Capricorn. He'd avoid planting during a fire sign in the waning moon, considering those days better for clearing land or destroying weeds. And he'd treat certain periods, particularly when the moon was in its dark phase just before the new moon, as rest days for the soil when nothing significant should be planted or transplanted. Every community had variations on these rules, additional considerations passed down through generations. Some farmers believed that crops planted in the light of the moon, when it rose before midnight, would yield better than those planted in the dark of the moon when it rose after midnight. Others swore that the specific time of day mattered, with early morning planting in a favorable sign better than late afternoon in the same sign. Many farmers tracked not just the moon, but also the signs of spring, the blooming of certain wildflowers, the first calls of particular birds, the feel of the soil at a specific depth. These observations were woven together with the moon signs into a comprehensive system of agricultural timing. The almanacs that codified this knowledge were fixtures in farmhouses across America. The Old Farmer's Almanac had been publishing since 1792, but it was Bloom's almanac that many farmers in the mid-20th century relied on specifically for planting information. These weren't casual publications. They were carefully consulted reference books, marked up with notes from previous years, compared against the farmer's own observations and records. A farmer might note in the margins, planted corn May 12th, moon in Leo waxing, good germination, dry summer but good yield. Or potatoes in ground, March 22nd, moon in Virgo, waning, wet spring, some rot. Over years and decades, these personal annotations created a localized body of knowledge that supplemented the general rules. So why did this practice see a resurgence, or at least maintain such strong persistence, during the 1950s and early 1960s, when modern agriculture was supposedly sweeping away old superstitions? The answer is complex and deeply rooted in the actual experience of farming during that transitional era. First, the new agricultural technologies weren't universally successful, at least not immediately. Hybrid corn varieties were indeed producing higher yields, but they required significant capital investment in seed each year, since farmers couldn't save seed from hybrid crops. Chemical fertilizers boosted production, but also represented a new recurring expense, and farmers were still learning how to apply them effectively without burning crops or creating other problems. Pesticides worked, but pests were already beginning to develop resistance in some areas. For small and medium-sized family farms, the financial risk of fully committing to the new methods was significant. If something went wrong, if yields didn't increase enough to offset the higher input costs, a family could lose everything. In that context, the old methods represented a kind of insurance. They were free, or nearly so. Following the moon signs required only attention and timing, not cash outlays. A farmer could adopt some of the new technologies while still maintaining traditional practices as a hedge against failure. And when both old and new methods were being used, and yields were indeed good, farmers often attributed the success to the combination, with the moon signs getting particular credit, because they aligned with the farmer's sense of working with natural rhythms rather than trying to dominate nature through chemistry. Second, the period from the late 1950s into the 1960s saw unusual weather patterns in many agricultural regions. There were drought years, particularly in the late 1950s in the Midwest and parts of the South. There were unseasonably late springs and early frosts. Rainfall was unpredictable. In such conditions, timing became absolutely critical. A week's difference in planting date could mean the difference between a crop that matured before drought hit and one that withered in the fields. Farmers who paid close attention to timing, who watched not just the calendar, but natural indicators and moon phases, often did get better results than those who planted strictly by conventional calendar dates recommended by Extension services. It's important to understand that the Extension Service recommendations were based on broad regional averages and general principles. They couldn't account for the microclimate of every individual farm, the specific characteristics of a particular piece of ground, or the intuitive knowledge that came from farming the same land for decades. An old farmer who knew that the South 40 always warmed up 5 days earlier than the North plot, who could feel when the soil had exactly the right moisture content, who noticed that certain wildflowers bloomed reliably 2 weeks before the last frost, could time his planting with precision that no general recommendation could match. And when he also consulted the moon signs and his crops came up strong while his neighbors struggled, he credited the signs. The social aspect of this practice was equally important. In rural communities of the 1950s and 1960s, knowledge was still largely oral and local. Farmers talked to each other constantly, comparing notes, sharing observations, debating methods. At the grain elevator, at church socials, at farm auctions over coffee at the local diner, agricultural knowledge circulated through conversation. When respected farmers in a community credited the moon signs for their success, others paid attention. Reputation mattered. If old Jim, who'd been farming that land for 40 years and consistently brought in good yields, swore by planting corn in Leo during the second quarter of the moon, young farmers listened. There was also an element of pattern recognition at work, something the human brain is exceptionally good at, even when the patterns aren't perfectly consistent. When a farmer planted by the signs and got good results, he remembered it, and the practice was reinforced. When results were poor, there were always other explanations. Too much rain, not enough rain, pest pressure, poor seed, bad luck. The human tendency to notice confirmations and discount contradictions meant that successful plantings by the signs were remembered and discussed, while failures were attributed to other causes. Over time, this created a community memory that strongly associated the moon signs with agricultural success. The actual mechanisms by which moon phases might influence plant growth remained debated, even among believers. Some farmers offered what seemed like plausible physical explanations. They noted that the moon's gravitational pull caused ocean tides, so why wouldn't it also affect the movement of moisture through soil? During the full moon, they reasoned, groundwater tables might be slightly higher, providing more moisture to germinating seeds. Others pointed to the increased light from a full moon, suggesting that even the small amount of additional illumination at night could influence plant growth, particularly for seedlings. Some referenced the fact that many animals and plants did show lunar-influenced behaviors, from coral spawning to certain flowering patterns, so why not crop plants? The scientific establishment, by and large, was skeptical. Research conducted at agricultural universities during the 1960s and 1970s generally failed to find consistent, reproducible evidence that moon phases significantly affected crop yields when all other variables were controlled. Extension agents and university agronomists tended to view planting by the signs as a harmless but ultimately meaningless tradition, a cultural holdover that farmers would abandon as they became more educated and scientific in their approach. The prevailing attitude was that any apparent successes were due to other factors: good timing that happened to coincide with favorable moon phases, superior farmer skill and attention that would have produced good results regardless of the moon, or simple coincidence and selective memory. But something interesting was lost in that dismissal. The farmers who planted by the signs weren't just following a simple superstition mechanically. They were paying close attention to their land and their crops in a comprehensive way. They were noting the moon, yes, but also the soil temperature, the soil moisture, the weather patterns, the behavior of wild plants and animals, the feel of the air, the appearance of the sky. They were integrating multiple streams of information and making decisions based on a holistic assessment of conditions. The moon signs provided a framework for this attention, a way of organizing observations and timing actions. A farmer who checked the almanac to find the best day for planting his tomatoes was also going to walk his fields, evaluate soil conditions, watch the weather forecast, consider his schedule and available labor. He wasn't blindly planting on a single predetermined date, no matter what. The moon signs suggested a window of opportunity, but within that window, the farmer's judgment and experience still governed the final decision. In many cases, what looked like planting by the signs was actually skilled farming using traditional timing markers, with the moon system serving as one tool among many. Consider a specific example from Madison County, North Carolina, in 1962. A tobacco farmer named Vernon McAllister planted his tobacco seedlings in late April during a waxing moon in Cancer, a water sign ideal for leaf crops. His cousin, farming similar land less than 2 miles away, planted his seedlings a week later during what the almanac listed as a barren period, a waning moon in Leo. Vernon's tobacco thrived, establishing strong growth before a dry spell in May. His cousins struggled with poorer germination and slower initial growth that left the plants vulnerable when the dry weather hit. By harvest time, Vernon's yield was nearly 20% higher. Was it the moon signs? Vernon certainly thought so, and told anyone who'd listen, but several other factors were also at play. The week difference in planting meant Vernon's seedlings had an extra week of cooler, moister conditions to establish roots before the dry weather. Vernon was also known as a meticulous farmer who prepared his beds carefully and paid close attention to soil moisture. His cousin, while a good farmer, was juggling tobacco farming with a part-time job in town and may not have had the same time for detailed land preparation. Vernon's success reinforced the practice of moon planting in his community, while the complexity of factors contributing to that success went unexamined. Multiply that story across thousands of farms and dozens of crops, and you begin to see how the belief in planting by the signs could sustain itself even in the face of scientific skepticism. Every season produced enough apparent confirmations to keep the practice alive. And the practice itself, by encouraging careful attention to timing and conditions, may have contributed to better outcomes, independent of whether the moon itself had any direct influence. The social dynamics of rural communities in this era also created conditions where traditional practices could flourish even as modernization advanced in other areas. These were communities where multiple generations often farmed near each other, where children grew up in the fields, working alongside parents and grandparents, where knowledge transfer was experiential rather than theoretical. When a grandfather told his grandson that you don't plant beans in a fire sign during the dark of the moon, that wasn't presented as folklore or interesting trivia. It was practical instruction, delivered with the same weight as showing how to harness a team of mules or adjust a plow depth. The grandson might go to school and learn about photosynthesis and plant biology, might even take agricultural classes where moon planting was dismissed as superstition. But the knowledge from the fields carried a different kind of authority. It was tested knowledge, proven by generations of survival and success. It was embodied in the grandfather's weathered hands and successful farm, and it was emotionally weighted with family tradition and respect for elders. To reject it wasn't just a matter of choosing a different agricultural practice. It could feel like rejecting family wisdom and the people who held it. This created a situation where many farmers in the 1950s and 1960s lived in a kind of dual consciousness. They might use hybrid seeds and chemical fertilizers, drive tractors equipped with the latest implements, even attend extension service workshops on modern farming techniques. But they'd also consult the almanac, plant by the signs, and follow traditional timing practices that had been passed down for generations. These weren't contradictory to them. They were complementary approaches that together provided the best chance for success. Women often played a crucial role in maintaining these traditions, particularly when it came to garden planting and food preservation. While men might be more influenced by the extension service recommendations and modern agricultural advertising, women who managed household gardens frequently relied on traditional knowledge shared among women in the community. They knew when to plant vegetables by the signs, when to harvest herbs for maximum potency, when to can and preserve food for best quality, since household gardens remained critical for family food security, even on prosperous farms. The success or failure of garden crops had immediate, tangible consequences. When garden vegetables thrived under moon sign planting, the practice was validated in the most practical way possible. The religious dimension of rural life also intersected with moon sign planting in complex ways. Most farming communities in America during this period were deeply Christian, primarily Protestant denominations ranging from Baptist to Methodist to various Pentecostal churches. Biblical agriculture was referenced frequently, with passages about seed time and harvest, about the seasons and times for different activities. The idea that God had created an ordered universe, where celestial bodies had purposes and influences, wasn't foreign to people who believed in divine providence and natural order. Some Christians were uncomfortable with the astrological aspects of moon planting. Seeing too much overlap with horoscopes and zodiac signs, they considered ungodly. Others made distinctions between using the zodiac calendar for farming purposes versus believing in astrological personality traits and predictions. Many simply didn't think about it in religious terms at all. It was farming practice, handed down from parents and no more spiritually significant than knowing which crops to rotate or how to cure tobacco. The almanac sat on the shelf next to the family Bible, and both were consulted regularly without any perceived conflict. As the 1960s progressed and agriculture continued to industrialize, the practice of planting by the signs gradually declined, though it never disappeared entirely. Larger farms operating on industrial scales couldn't afford to wait for ideal moon signs, when planting had to be coordinated with available labor, machinery schedules, and market timing. The economics of large-scale agriculture demanded efficiency and consistency that didn't mesh well with lunar timing considerations. Younger farmers increasingly received formal agricultural education where traditional practices were given little credence. The countercultural movement of the late 1960s and 1970s would eventually rediscover and romanticize these old methods, but by then the generational knowledge transfer was already breaking down in many communities. Yet evidence of the practice's persistence in the 1950s and early 1960s is abundant if you know where to look. Almanac sales remained strong throughout the period. Agricultural journals of the era occasionally published letters from farmers defending moon sign practices and sharing their success stories. Oral history projects conducted in Appalachian and rural southern communities in later decades captured countless memories of this practice. The Old Farmer's Almanac and similar publications continued to include planting tables by moon signs precisely because their readers demanded them. Even some extension agents, speaking privately rather than in official capacities, admitted they'd seen enough inexplicable successes with traditional timing methods to remain agnostic about whether there might be something to it. The question of whether moon sign planting actually worked in a measurable scientific sense remains open in some ways. Large-scale controlled studies generally haven't supported the practice, but agricultural research is notoriously difficult because of the enormous number of variables involved. Soil differences, weather variations, pest pressures, crop varieties, and farmer skill all influence outcomes. Isolating the effect of moon phase or zodiac sign from all these other factors requires large sample sizes over multiple years, and such research has rarely been funded comprehensively. Some smaller studies have suggested possible effects on germination rates or growth patterns, but results haven't been consistently reproducible. What's clearer is that the practice worked as a framework for careful, attentive farming. It encouraged farmers to pay attention to timing, to observe natural signs, to plan their work according to a systematic approach rather than haphazard scheduling. It provided a language for discussing agricultural timing that was widely understood within farming communities. And it connected farmers to a long historical tradition, giving them a sense of participating in agricultural knowledge that stretched back through generations. The farmers of the 1950s and 1960s, who swore their yields jumped when they started planting, by the signs were reporting their genuine experience. Whether the moon itself was the active agent, or whether the practice led to better overall farming through increased attention and traditional wisdom, or whether good results simply coincided with favorable conditions that happened to align with moon phases, is perhaps less important than recognizing that this system served real functions in the agricultural world of that era. It represented a way of farming that valued accumulated experience over purely theoretical knowledge. It maintained community connections and generational links in a time of rapid change. It provided farmers with a sense of agency and control in a profession where so much remained beyond human control. And it reminded people that agriculture, despite all the scientific advances and technological innovations, remained fundamentally about working with natural processes that weren't fully understood and couldn't be completely dominated by human will. When Harold Jessup stood in his barn that March evening in 1957, marking planting dates in his almanac, he was participating in an agricultural tradition that was simultaneously ancient and actively contemporary. He was also making practical decisions about the year's crops using every tool available to him: his father's experience, his own observations, the weather patterns he'd tracked for years, and yes, the moon signs printed in that worn almanac. When harvest came that fall and his yields were indeed good, Harold credited the signs, told his neighbors about it over coffee at the co-op, and ensured that for at least another year, the tradition would continue in his corner of Indiana. The story of planting by the signs in mid-century American agriculture is ultimately a story about how traditional knowledge persists, adapts, and finds value even in the midst of modernization. It's about farmers making the best decisions they could with the information and resources available to them. And it's a reminder that the history of agriculture isn't a simple march from ignorance to enlightenment, but rather a complex negotiation between old and new, between tradition and innovation, between what science says should work and what farmers observe actually working in their fields. Thank you for watching this exploration of a fascinating chapter in American agricultural history. If you found this journey into the farming practices of the 1950s and 1960s interesting, please consider subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into traditional American farming knowledge. Give this video a thumbs up and share it with anyone who appreciates the wisdom of our agricultural heritage. This content is inspired by real historical practices and the genuine experiences of American farmers, and is not intended to represent or offend any particular individuals or groups. The practices described reflect the beliefs and methods of the period being discussed.